really an honor to be here, and an honor to be with all of you today. I know you've had a long, interesting, full of enthusiasm day, and so I'm just going to lecture you for an hour and a half. No, I'm joking. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. But I did want to talk a little bit about the importance of your story and your perspective and running for office. I know that will be surprising hearing this from the president of Emily's List. As I was listening to Zara's story and thinking, boy, I got to figure out how to run her for office soon. Zara, where are you? Are you still here? Can we talk after this? Because, wow, we're ready. We're ready. Whenever you're ready, Emily's List is ready. You just give us a call. We're there. We are absolutely there. It's a reminder that each and every one of us has our own story to tell that brought us all here together today. And those stories are the diverse perspectives that we need to make our government work for everyone. So, see if this works. This is where my story begins. And yes, that is me. A few decades ago. Before I was the president of Emily's List, and before I figured out how to help Democrats win in red states, and before I was the campaign manager for Al Franken and John Tester and the finance director for Howard Dean, yes, I work for a lot of dudes, I was just a kid growing up in Butte, Montana. And one thing you may not know about my home state of Montana is that we were actually the first state in the country to elect a woman to Congress. That's right, Jeanette Rankin. There'll be a test later. Jeanette Rankin, who was sworn into office exactly 100 years ago this year. She ran for Congress before women across the country even had the right to vote. There were actually some at the time, even in the suffrage movement, who really thought she shouldn't run and told her so because they thought that a woman running and losing would slow down the movement and maybe prevent women from getting suffrage. But Jeanette Rankin ran anyway, and she won. And at the time she ran and won, she realized she would not be the first, that there would be many, many after her, and so be it. She was right about that. She actually was also the person who stood on the floor of the United States House of Representatives all by herself. Think about this. Literally the only woman in the room, including staff, because trust me, those guys weren't hiring any women either. And she was the one who presented the bill, the initial amendment for the 19th Amendment for women's right to vote. It does take a woman to be there at the table, to have these conversations. But fast forward 100 years to where we are now, and women who make up more than half of the country's population are still just 19% of Congress. We have made progress, and that is important to recognize. You know, I think about my grandma Nancy, who's lived in Mason City her entire life, small town in Iowa. She was born, my grandmother, before women had the right to vote in this country. And last year, she saw for the very first time a woman win the Iowa presidential caucus. That is, in fact, progress in her lifetime. But unfortunately, in the United States, we're just not progressing at the same rates as the rest of the world. In 1997, the US was ranked 52nd in the world for women's representation in government. By 2017, we dropped to 100th. 100th. In spite the fact that this country's elected 112 more women to the House of Representatives, 20 more women to the Senate over that same period. When countries from Afghanistan to Australia and Pakistan to Portugal have higher percentages of women serving in office, it begs the question, why is our country falling so far behind? What's driving this problem? And most importantly, how do we fix it? To start, it helps to understand the story of a woman named Harriet Woods, who ran for the United States Senate in Missouri in 1982. At the time, no Democratic woman had won a seat in her own right in the United States Senate. Harriet, who was the first woman ever elected statewide in the state of Missouri, had already run and won tough races in the past, and that year she was on track to win that U.S. Senate seat. She'd already won the Democratic nomination. She was campaigning tirelessly. Polls showed that the ads that she was running were working, and she was getting very, very close to tying her opponent with less than 1 month left in the election. But in spite of all that, the Democratic Party still did not think a woman in Missouri could beat a Republican incumbent who was a man. They decided to stop investing in Harriet's race, and so on this very same day that she officially tied in the polls, Harriet ran out of money. The ads came down, her campaign was grinding to a halt. She ended up losing by less than 2 percentage points, 26,000 votes out of 1.5 million. It's important to understand electing more women to office isn't something that just happens on its own. The countries that are so far ahead of us when it comes to women's representation are ahead because they are doing things differently. Yes, some governments have quotas, and that is one approach. Ironically, some, like Afghanistan, have quotas because the international community demanded it, a community that we were part of in the demanding. But what research shows is that countries where there is a big increase in the number of women serving in government in their countries is where major political parties have voluntarily made electing women the priority. Well, we've seen how well this can work in the United States. So this graph shows the increase in the numbers of women Americans have elected in Congress from the Democrats and Republican parties over time. The blue line is the Democratic Party. I know, unique. The red line represents the Republican Party. And you'll notice that both lines are basically the same until you get to 1985. And I might add that they look pretty pathetic. That's not a lot of growth from the Janet Rankin era, right? Long, slow road. But 1985, as you can tell, something happens and the blue line really starts to climb. That's because in 1985, Emily's List was founded. Now see, the Democratic Party didn't come to the realization that it should start supporting women candidates all on its own. In fact, the reason Emily's List got started in the first place was because our founder, Ellen Malcolm, who I know many of you know, saw what happened to Harriet Woods. She knew people in both parties just simply refused to to believe that women could win campaigns, and so they wouldn't fund them. And so Ellen Malcolm decided to prove them wrong. And she brought together some friends to raise money for a smart, scrappy social worker from Baltimore, Maryland, named Barbara Mikulski. She was running to win a United States Senate race in Maryland, and she won. Since then, Emily's List has grown into the nation's largest resource for women in politics. We've helped to elect 116 pro-choice Democratic women to the U.S. House, 23 women to the Senate, 12 governors, hundreds and hundreds of women to state and local office. None of these numbers are enough, but it is progress. Our community of activists is now more than 5 million strong, and we've raised and spent, I should note the spent part, over $500 million in this crusade. What our work has shown is that when women run and get the support they need, women win. They win even under some of the toughest circumstances and in some of the toughest years. I guess you could say that women know a thing or two about running in an uneven playing field. And though there are still offices, many, way too many, that have never been held by women in our country, we keep making ground year by year. In 2016, despite not breaking through that ultimate political glass ceiling, Emily's List did have some bright spots. 8 new members to the US House, nearly 100 women to state and local offices, 4 of the 5 new Democratic United States senators elected in 2016 were Emily's List candidates. 3 of those women were women of color. I'm going to put that in further context. Until last year, there have only been 2 women of color in the United States Senate in our history, 20 years apart. We have so much work to do. And the women we've helped elect, they bring new voices and new perspectives to the debate and the momentum to the progressive movement we need. All of this is not to say that Republican women can't or shouldn't run for office. Democrats can't get to parity on our own. The truth is that the Republican Party just hasn't made electing women a priority in the same way as the Democratic Party. And I would argue that the reason for that is that there's no Republican version of Emily's List, which I do like to remind some of my Republican counterparts that I work with in Washington. Until something changes, that red line is staying right where it is. For that blue line to move, Emily's List had to convince the Democratic Party, and still has to have some tough conversations on a regular basis, that counting women out is a losing strategy. We had to make them see it to believe it. But once they did, there's no turning back. So what happens once you've begun to prove once and for all that women can run competitive campaigns? What happens when you've insisted that your party should make electing women a priority? In fact, in our recruitment this election cycle, as we work to find incredible, diverse women across the country to run for the United States House of Representatives, I have sat with the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, who said to me his recruitment priorities are women and veterans. I said, great, I've got a bunch of women veterans. That is a huge change. That is a huge change in the trajectory of the party. And now that we've built a community, though it needs to increase, with resources and money to back them up, what else do we need to do? Well, the answer is that more women have to make the decision to run for office. A decision, by the way, that I'm going to ask each and every one of you today to do before you leave this room. What we've found at Emily's List is that women often have to be asked to run for office more than once before they say yes. And funny, I would say, men never seem to have this problem. Also, I want you to note that you've been officially asked once already in this conversation. For whatever reason, men are statistically more likely to think they're qualified to run, whether they have a good reason to think so or not. One study took a group of women and men who basically had identical credentials and asked them some questions about running for office. Okay, the answers are pretty revealing. 35% of the men who were interviewed thought they were very qualified to run, compared with 22% of women. This one's a good one. Of those who considered themselves totally unqualified to run, 55% of the men had still given the idea of running some thought. Now, sisters, I know we do not have the same mindset as that. There's also the reality, which we were just talking about, that running for office, it takes up a lot of time. And there are real, tough logistical questions that you have to ask yourself before you start a campaign. Questions like, how am I going to cover my basic expenses? If I leave my current job and run full time, who's going to get the mail and walk the dog and pick up the groceries? And on top of that, we all know too well that women are 15 times more likely than men to be responsible for childcare. If you've never run for office before, it can be hard to figure out where to go to answer some of those questions. I have recruited many women over these years, and I can tell you everyone starts out with some questions and concerns at the beginning of the process. But it doesn't mean it's not doable. We have role models who have been now through almost every situation. Single mothers, single ladies, full families with lots of children, needing to decide where they're going to put their kids to school. Here's the thing. I can put you on the phone with an elected official, a woman somewhere in this country who has had that situation now, and they can walk you through what it is like to do it. It is not always easy, and as some like to say, it can take a village, but it is so, so worth it at the end. Because we do have questions and concerns that we've got to walk through, but that does not mean it's not doable. It doesn't mean that you're not qualified to run. It means you have to get from, can I do this, to yes, I can. Now, right now, something very special is happening in this country, and it is unprecedented in the years of Emily's List. The day after the Women's March in Washington, 500 women showed up at an Emily's List training to be candidates in Washington, D.C. Since then, more than 13,000 women have reached out to us about running for office across this country, all 50 states. All races, all backgrounds, all ages. And you've got to understand, that is more women than we have ever trained in the history of Emily's List. So we're expanding rapidly, and we are ready. But these women they're not waiting to be asked, right? They're not asking for permission. They are raising their hand. They are leaning in. They're saying, my voice needs to be heard. And all this energy is coming not a moment too soon for what is going on. This is a time when we need women standing up and speaking out like never before. We need women who took to the streets in January to be at the ballot box in November, and we need a lot of them on the ballot. Why? Why does this matter so much? Well, it matters because the stakes for women and girls literally could not be any higher than it is right now. We know that the only way to get better politics and policies in our climate is to ensure women with diverse perspectives are in the rooms where the decisions are getting made. You see, women don't just fight for women, they fight for families. They fight for fairness and inclusion and justice. They fight for better opportunities for girls, for access to education, for recognition of their potential, both now and in the future. That's why when California elected Nancy Pelosi, you got health care reform. When California elected Barbara Boxer, you got $1 billion in federal funding for after-school programs. When California elected Dianne Feinstein, you got funding for breast cancer research. And that's why this work matters so much. And it also matters because one of the most important things we can do for young women and girls in this country is elect women who will show them that they believe their experiences are important, that their diverse perspectives matter, and that their voices deserve not just to be heard, but to be listened to. I mean, think about what girls across this country are seeing right now in our government. And not even in the terms of policies, though Those are pretty atrocious. But in terms of how women are getting portrayed, disregarded, demeaned, folks, all those all-white male photo ops, that one, that's not a mistake. It's a strategy, and it's a decision that administration is making. The men in power know the policies they're hurting are going to hurt, or the policy they're pursuing, I should say, they're going to hurt women and girls. What they also know is that the greatest threat to their agenda is for the voices of women and girls to be heard. They know that. That's why we have to be louder than ever. They may not be able to silence women completely, but they can keep us out of the frame for now. And those photos, sends a message to girls that they don't belong in the places where the decisions are getting made. That's one more reason why it is more important now than ever to elect women to office who will fight not just for girls, but also show them by example that it's possible to grow up and do exactly the same. If they see it, then they know they can be it, and no one can take that away. If they see it consistently, over time, that's how real and lasting change gets made. I can tell you how this worked in my own life. So when I was a student at Butte High School in Montana, a woman named Nancy Keenan came to speak. Now, some of you may know her from her time as the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America. But before that, before she even came to speak at my high school, she'd been a public school teacher. And before that, Nancy had worked her way through college in a job in a smelter, which literally is this big, gigantic heater that melts down copper. This is not an easy job. When I heard her speak, she was the superintendent of public instruction in Montana. That's a statewide elected office in a big state. And she was from a tiny town called Anaconda, just down the road from my hometown of Butte. And I remember being just amazed that someone, a woman, who started out working in a smelter in Anaconda, could someday go on and run for office and win. But Nancy did, and there we were, all listening to her. And it made me think a little bit differently about what was possible for me and what I should do. So I thought I'd roll up my sleeves right away. I ended up running for class president in high school on 3 different occasions. I didn't win the first time, and I really didn't win the second time. But the third time, I pulled it off. And that's the other thing you got to remember. For the younger women in the room, and frankly for all of us, it's a good reminder. Even if you don't win the first time, and if you don't win the second time, and maybe if you don't win the third time, you just keep trying. In our mind at Emily's List, a loss is just a step in the process. In college, I went on and worked in student government, which I am a huge fan of, student government, by the way. I managed a classmate's student government campaign for president, and when she became the first African-American woman student body president we'd ever had in Mankato, Minnesota, it is as white as it sounds, I found my true calling, which is winning campaigns and running campaigns. And that work in student government, that experience in student government, led me to my first job on a campaign where I actually got paid. And that campaign was my first experience of Emily's List and the power of Emily's List, and it's something I've never forgotten. See, my job was the finance director, and every night I'd jump in my car and I'd drive down to Rochester, Minnesota, And I would go to our P.O. box, and I would get our checks. This is way before there was any online giving. I'm dating myself. But I had to go get the mail, and I got to get our checks. And then I'd go back to the office, and I'd open them up, and I'd sort through them all. And because of Emily's List, we'd get checks from literally all over the country for $5 or $15. And the best part is that they would come with these little notes on them. And they were like, Mary, we've got your back. We're so proud of you. You go get them, girl. I mean, it's just amazing. We had this wall in the back of the office of all these little notes. That was the power of a movement coming together to change the face of politics. And I had no way of knowing at that time, but one of the women out there writing her first check to Emily's List was someone that I was going to recruit for the US Senate across the table with a lot of glasses of iced tea years later. In fact, the very first political action Elizabeth Warren took, other than voting, was writing that first check to Emily's List. It all loops around. And if Elizabeth was here, she'd say the same thing, which is what she understood then and what I want everyone in the room to understand today is, and if you don't already, which you probably do, which is this. Even if, I hope this isn't the answer, but even if you don't run for office yourself, you still need to help a sister run. Because either way, when you run for office yourself or when you help a woman who can, you're showing young women and girls that it's possible for them. You know, I just talked about how seeing Nancy Keenan changed my trajectory. Well, what do we think it means for so many other girls today? I mean, think about what it means for the girls growing up and seeing Val Demings, who started out in a segregated public school as a kid and went on to be the first woman chief of police in Orlando, today serving in Congress. Or Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy right next to her, who came to this country as a child and a refugee from Vietnam, serving together today. Or Catherine Cortez Masto, who's serving as our first ever Latina U.S. Senator out of this great state of Nevada. Or her very close friend and fellow former Attorney General, Kamala Harris, who's only the second African American and the first Indian American woman ever to serve in the United States Senate. I will say we did try really hard to add that Donna Edwards, who we love, in Maryland to make it the second and third, but we gotta keep pushing forward. We gotta keep pushing forward. But here's the thing with those two incredible women serving in the United States Senate, because their voices are there, because they're leading the way, they are now leading the conversation at the decision-making tables. That will have an impact far, far into the future. And it's also a reminder of why it's so important to continue the work that we've started. So I've already asked you to think about what it means for girls to see those women who are serving in government. Now, I want you to think about the difference it would make for them to see you doing the same. Think about the brain trust in this room. Honestly, the power in this room. You know better than anyone else what's best for girls in this country. You are the experts and the activists, whether you're running an after-school program or you're fighting for girls' rights as an attorney, whether you started an organization to help girls express themselves through art and music, or working to end sex trafficking, or teaching girls how to code, you should be the ones making policy. And to all the young women and girls in this room, I want you to know we need you most of all. You can start today. You can be involved in making your communities better. In fact, you already are. You wouldn't be here. But just think about how fun it would be to run for office. It is fun. You meet the most amazing people. And you can do it in your neighborhood association or in your student government or your city council, by the way. Just check on the age limits. You'd be surprised how low they are in so many places. Your ideas, your perspectives, your passion, and your energy is needed. It's needed now. We believe your experiences and your perspectives matter no matter what age. And what our country needs are those perspectives to move forward. We will, I promise you, all be better off because our government will be more focused not just on a select few, but on our entire communities when you are there. So I'm going to give it to you straight. If you can march, you can run. If you can run, you can win. And even if you don't run, you can still help a sister win. That's how we're going to ignite change. Thank you. Thank you so much.